Hello, and welcome to Grade.com Talks With. Today, we're talking with Gary Oppenheimer, the founder of AmpleHarvest.org and program of Faith Fight Food Waste, a program that is addressing the issue of food waste and overconsumption with tangible, local, and spiritually cultivating practices that any faith community can undertake. And if you're new to our podcast, please press subscribe button either on YouTube or your podcast app, because today we're going to learn about a program that is helping faith leaders and communities to take part in ending hunger. Hello, Gary. Welcome to Grade.com Talks. So it's very excited to have you here.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
How would you describe your program to someone who is not familiar with your work?
Faith Fights Food Waste is an education program about the waste of food, originally built for clergy, for faith leaders of all religions. And it's intended to allow the faith leaders to speak about food waste, or I should say the waste of food, from their own faith perspective. Historically, from the beginning of time, all faiths, the faith leaders have spoken about the need to feed, help, and house hungry, poor people. I mean, that's a very important part of any religion. Feeding somebody is nice and important, but it doesn't solve one of the root causes of hunger, which is the waste of food. And yet, if you looked in the spiritual writings, the traditions of all of the religions, in one way or another, they all talk about not wasting food. But that's historically been sort of glossed over by the faith leaders. We recognized that, and we wanted to enable Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Unitarian clergy to not only speak about feeding hungry people, but actually reducing the waste of food so that hunger is itself reduced. The idea behind faithfightsfoodwaste.org, which is the domain name, is to educate a faith leader about the issue of the waste of food. We provide all the different material from other NGOs, TED Talks, etc. So they first themselves can get up to speed on it. We then give them a sermon that is written in their own faith tradition. We give them 9 calls to actions. And we also give them even a game show for their religious school. So regardless of the religion, let's pretend for a minute a Christian pastor wants to give a sermon on the waste of food. The pastor would come to the faithfightsfoodwaste.org, select Christian, faith leader. Everything that they need is there. They download the sermon. It's written as an editable Word file. They then rewrite it so it's their own words. Then they select the calls to action that the members of their congregation would connect with, could do, and then they give the sermon. It is that simple. Then for the rest of time, as long as they are giving a sermon about hunger, they can't not include also food waste as that particular item. The program was designed originally as foodwasteweekend.org. We launched it in the spring of 2016. And that was a very noisy time in the media because Trump and Clinton were in their campaign. So the media was really focused on the election. We really didn't get a lot of people hearing about it, but we ran it as a pilot for several years. The original program was intended for all of the clergy to do their sermons all on the same weekend. So that on Friday, an imam, on Saturday, a rabbi, on Sunday, a priest would be in the mosque and the synagogue and the church talking about the waste of food. And we thought that was a wonderful thing for all these different religions to be coming together on a single topic at the same time. People loved it. The clergy loved it. The faith community loved it. The problem is that finding the right weekend every year becomes a real challenge. Holidays move around, Jewish holidays change, Ramadan moves all over the place. We decided to change it in 2020 to a year-round program so that a faith leader could take advantage of it any time of the year that works for them. And hence, it's now called faithfightsfoodwaste.org.
Wonderful. Faith leaders are usually opinion leaders within their communities, and the fact that you are communicating the issue of food waste through the opinion leaders to bring more attention, to bring more awareness to the hunger and overconsumption is a wonderful initiation, because more people can, when they go to the church, when they go to synagogue, when they go to mosque or other religious places, buildings, they can learn about the issue, and they can educate themselves and take action when needed. How important is being consumption conscious in religions that you work with?
The religions, all in different ways, speak about making sure that you share the food that you have, that you don't waste food. I actually printed out some quotes from some of the different sermons. So let me share just a few of them. In the Christian tradition, in Matthew, Jesus taught us that when we feed a hungry person, we are feeding him. In the Jewish tradition, is it not your bread to share with the hungry? In the Unitarian faith, hunger erodes that dignity and attacks that worth. They all speak about it in different ways. But I wanted to step back just for a moment to take a bigger picture. There are many of us around the world for the past 10 or more years that have been speaking about, let's not waste food. Make sure that people who need food get it, but the food that we have doesn't go to waste. We've been doing TED Talks, speeches, writing books, all these different things. But I was very concerned that for the average person on the street who really just wants to pay their bills, keep their job, keep their kids out of trouble, we weren't getting on their radar. This is not a concern of theirs. They were really focused on the immediate issues in their lives, and something as, I'll say, lofty as food waste just didn't get to them. But once a week, hundreds of millions 88 million in America and billions around the world go to their house of worship to voluntarily listen to a faith leader who speaks in their tradition, in their language, about the things they both believe in, to listen to a person who speaks with the authority of a God, of the scriptures, of the traditions, and they listen to that person because what that person says is very important, very valuable, and I might add, is something that when that person comes home from the service, they teach their children. And so reaching out into the faith community, I thought was incredibly valuable and necessary. The scriptures already speak about food waste. I'll give you one example that hit me early on. In the Old Testament, when the Hebrews leave Egypt and they are wandering in the desert, in the book of Exodus, God says to the Hebrews, I'm going to give you manna to eat, but don't take more than 1 day's portion, because if you take more than 1 day's portion, what the extra food is going to rot and be with maggots. Now, I'm Jewish, and all the times I went to synagogues, I never heard of a rabbi talking about that from a food waste perspective. And yet it's exactly what it's talking about. And that occurs in every other religion too. So the idea was to zero in on where those scriptures speak about this thing and get it onto the radar of the faith leader. What we've done here, by the way, is we tied this together with climate change, because food waste is a major contributor to climate change. So almost all of the sermons start with the issue of hunger, of food waste, and climate change being intertwined, and you solve climate change in part by not wasting food. Mm-hmm. So when we did this, and just to explain how this all came about, we sat down and we wrote a faithy sounding but faithless sermon. There was no mention of any particular God or religion, but it had a spiritual sound to it. And then we gave it to a partner organization, Green Faith, and we asked their faith experts to please translate this into Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Unitarian. And those experts came back with this initial sermon rewritten to speak to what the Quran says or what the Bible says or any of the other scriptural books, so that we can give those to the faith leaders. They're all saying the same thing, but they're speaking in their language. And speaking in their language, the people in the congregation are hearing something that's familiar and meaningful to them. And I believe it's a very, very impactful way of solving the problem. I should also add that we were ahead of ourselves when it came to the pandemic. We decided when we switched from Food Waste Week into Faith Fights Food Waste that there were people who would ordinarily be going, for example, to a church, but either couldn't go to the church, they're too far away, they don't belong to one, for example, or maybe they go to a church, but their pastor doesn't talk about food waste. So we made a version of what the pastor would be saying for the person of faith. So now, whether you are a Christian pastor or a Christian, whether you are a rabbi or a Jewish person, we did this for each faith, there are two versions of the same experience. One is for the faith leader who's going to learn about and speak, and the other is for the person of faith who's going to sit in their own home and take it all in. So when the pandemic occurred, and obviously houses of worship globally shut down, and people couldn't go to their house of worship, they could still benefit from Faith Fights Food Waste by selecting under the menu, I'm a person of this faith or that faith, and they take it all in. And from that point on, we have still reached them in their language, in what's meaningful to them, even if it didn't come from their pastor or their imam or pundit or whomever.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing some example of scriptures, both from different religions, Christianity, Judaism, and other that you mentioned. How likely a person of faith versus a person that doesn't belong to any faith to consume less and to not waste food?
That's a great question. For people who have learned that their tradition, I'm going to take a step backwards. I don't want to say that people of faith are different or better than people not of any faith. This is not a value judgment. We have a version of Faith Fights Food Waste that is exclusively for spiritual but secular. I'm spiritual, but I don't belong to a religion or house of worship. So we include that in here too. I want to be clear about that. When something is written and it addresses the way the person addresses something important to them, I believe they're going to be far more responsive than if simply a wonk was speaking about it. So you can have a scientific expert speaking about some topic and it will go over many people's heads. But ask a faith leader to speak about that same topic on the same science based on what their traditions say, how they align, suddenly it resonates. Suddenly it's a part of what's meaningful to them, and they take it home. And the proof in the pudding, I believe, is that when you go to a public lecture in a university and listen to an expert speaking about something, it's for you. But how likely are you years later to talk to your young child about what this professor spoke about? Probably not. But if your faith leader has said to you, this is what our traditions and scriptures say, this is what's important, then when you have young children later on, you remember that. And as part of your parenting, you want to teach them what's important, moralities and values. You include what you learned from that faith leader and impart it on your child. Faith is a very powerful force for people of faith. And so we're asking the faith community to say this is a major problem and a major opportunity around the world, reducing the waste of food. Use your power as a faith leader, use the power of faith to help move that needle even further. To reduce the waste of food and therefore to reduce hunger. We even have a piece in here for the faith leaders directly themselves to say when you have an event, a church service, a bar mitzvah, or a wedding, a Ramadan dinner, whatever, try to think about how not to waste food at that particular event. What can you do to either donate the food you can't use, reduce the portions? Think about how your own house of worship can make it a habit and a policy to end the waste of food and to do so on a sustainable basis. And you're doing it because your traditions say so. It reduces hunger. It reduces climate change.
That's quite interesting. You mentioned that when we hear scientists, when we hear professors, we take the information into our head. However, when we hear it from a faith leader, we take it to the heart because it's a part of our tradition, because it's a part of the value system that our community is surrounded with. Our
You
parents.
put that beautifully, by the way. Yes.
Thank you. Our parents taught us, and some things that we can teach our children. How religious institutions, when it comes to different religious, maybe church, synagogues, and mosques themselves, are taking action towards ending hunger? Are there food banks or food pantries within most churches or most mosques? If you could elaborate on that, that would be great.
What I'm going to say applies to the United States. I cannot speak for the rest of the world, but in the United States, 70%, 70, of food pantries are housed in a house of worship.
Mm.
This is the reason that the idea for Food Waste Weekend and now Faith Fights Food Waste came to us. Our core work, ampleharvest.org's core work, is helping gardeners across America donate excess food from their garden to a local food pantry, which means I need to get to a food pantry to join Ample.Harvest.org to receive the food, and I need to get to a gardener to learn that they can donate the food. That's our core work for the past 11 years. It dawned on us in 2016 that if 70% of the food pantries are in a house of worship, why not go to the house of worship, make them aware of food waste and the opportunity to reduce the waste of food, and that way encourage their food pantry to join Ample.Harvest.org. And when the pastor or the rabbi is giving the sermon, 35-40% of the people sitting in the pews are gardeners. They learn about donating the food. So this was a way of further moving the needle on the core work that Ampleharvest.org does. Ampleharvest.org's work is only in the U.S. Faith Fights Food Waste applies globally. Now, in all fairness, the website is entirely in English, with the exception that the Christian sermon, we also have a Spanish version. So if you happen to be in a country where English is not widely spoken, you would download the English sermon and translate it into the local language. So it has a global impact and opportunity there. Historically, houses of worship around the world have been involved in helping to feed hungry people. So what is the case in the United States may well be the case in most other countries around the world. In which case, when a faith leader speaks about don't waste food, you can reduce hunger and climate change, they're not only speaking to what do you do at home, but they're also speaking to how we're going to reduce hunger in our own community.
Wow, that's revealing statistics. 70% of food pantries and food banks being housed in a house of worship. That's quite eye-opening, at the same time not surprising, because you mentioned that many religions historically they advocate for feeding hunger. How do you see the role of faith and faith community in ending hunger both in the United States and the world in the upcoming years?
I would argue that first, using the food we already have is a great way to start. You know, in a world where a massive amount of food is lost to waste, just the United States, 40% of all food and 50% of all produce is never consumed. Mm-hmm. Imagine what that would do to hunger and malnutrition in the United States, particularly with the fresh food, with the produce. If more of it was consumed if people don't buy it, if it's not eaten in a restaurant or your home, that it gets donated to food pantries and food banks. It would change the dynamics on hunger and malnutrition, reduce diabetes, reduce obesity, hypertension. And these are all global pandemics, but right now I can only speak with the numbers of the United States. So the faith community can have a powerful influence on the health and, frankly, by extension, the wealth of the community and the country. And I say that because the cost to the country of treating diabetes and obesity and hypertension is in the billions and billions of dollars. The more that you reduce these diseases, which are all diet related, the lower the nation's healthcare costs are, which means by default you have a wealthier community and a wealthier country. And it also would start by a faith leader getting up on the pulpit and talking about what the traditions and the scriptures say about not wasting food. And by the way, the calls to action, there are 9 calls to action that were provided. Each one has its own page. Each one says, what is it? Why is it important? What's involved in doing it? And some background information. So the pastor may say, we're going to discuss gardeners donating food, reducing the size of the portions on your plate, and never shopping without a shopping list. Those are just 3 out of the 9. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, people around the community are going to the store with a shopping list to make sure they don't buy food that won't be eaten. They will maybe have smaller plates or use smaller portions so they're not scraping food off the edible, good food at the end of the day off of the plate. By the way, there's a huge piece of climate change right there. The food you don't eat breaks down into methane, which is 20 times worse than CO2 and exacerbates climate change. So all these things are intertwined, and it can all start by somebody of faith speaking about it. But the impact is sustained because they'll be speaking about it year after year in their sermons, and it gets passed on generation to generation to generation. And this is something that we know to be the case. I mean, anybody of any particular faith knows how important what their traditions are for them. And even if you're a person who says, I've decided to walk away from my faith, I've decided to walk away from my house of worship, it's not important to me, or it's not meaningful to me anymore, even if that were to happen, I don't think they would turn around and say, I'm going to start wasting food. This is one of those things where I think a person who walks away from their faith or religion, if they make the decision, will continue to be more aware of the waste of food and keep those efforts in their life to reduce that waste.
Indeed, the role that faith community and faith leaders can take in influencing and ending the hunger in the United States and overconsumption, malnutrition, is quite large to an extent. And your call to actions, nine call to actions that you indicated, are there to be a guiding map for faith leaders and faith community members to take action and be more responsible, both towards themselves, towards the community, and towards the land and the world that they live in. If someone would like to support Faith Fights Food Waste program, how can they do that?
Well, what you can do is make a contribution online to ampleharvest.org. You visit ampleharvest.org and you'd be able to make a contribution. The funding goes to helping us help more churches and synagogues and mosques and other houses of worship learn about Faith Fights Food Waste. It helps us expand the program. We're looking to add some additional religions to the mix. Other things you can do is go to your faith leader, go to your clergy and say, I heard about this great program. I would really appreciate it if you would visit faithfightsfoodwaste.org, learn about food waste, and talk to the congregation when you give a sermon. These are 2 very, very important things that people can do. In the United States, we have 88 million people of faith. We have around 300,000 clergy. Mm-hmm. So while we work with the major faith organizations, the National Council of Churches, Islamic Relief USA, the major Jewish organizations, etc., to help the clergy learn, nothing beats having a member in the congregation ask their faith leader, would you please talk about this? So both the financial support, which helps support the program and expand it, as well as what you do on the ground, I think are critically important. The financial support will absolutely help get more faith leaders speaking about it. It will also help, by the way, more gardeners across the United States donating more food to more food pantries in those very houses of worship. The impact of both is sustained because once the faith leader starts talking about the waste of food, they'll never forget that. And once the growers start donating their fresh harvest to food pantries, they won't stop doing that either. So this is an impact that has sustained on a sustainable basis.
Mm-hmm. The links to the faithfightsfoodwaste.org will be provided in the link in description, and you viewers and listeners can familiarize yourself with the program more in detail and learn how you can donate, as well as how you can educate and yourself and your faith community about the importance of this issue. Thank you so much, Gary. It was wonderful to get to know you and the wonderful work that your organization is doing.
Thank you very much. I deeply appreciate it.
Awesome. For you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, please press like and share button, because this will show the YouTube algorithm and the podcast algorithm that this conversation is important, that faith leaders and religious communities can take part in ending hunger and malnutrition, both in the United States and across the world. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.